The gym smelt of sweat, chalk, and worn-out leather. A place where men came to test their limits, where fighters carved their names into the walls with blood, bruises, and reputation. It was a sanctuary for some, a proving ground for others. But for one man, it was just a workplace. Elijah worked as a janitor in that gym. He moved through the facility each day with a mop and bucket, wiping down mats, cleaning lockers, and emptying trash cans while others trained for glory under the bright fluorescent lights. Elijah's presence was often ignored, as if he were a shadow against the walls. A tall, broad-shouldered black man with quiet eyes and a calm demeanor, he spoke only when necessary and did his work with diligence. Some of the fighters nodded politely at him, appreciating the cleanliness he brought to their training space. But others, the ones blinded by arrogance, saw him as nothing more than a background figure, someone beneath notice. Among those men was Victor Kane, the gym's head MMA trainer. A former fighter with a scarred face and an ego to match, Victor was known for his brutal training methods and an even more brutal personality. He barked orders, mocked beginners, and carried himself like a king in his own small kingdom. His students feared him as much as they admired him, and his arrogance grew unchecked in an environment where no one dared to challenge him. But Victor had a flaw, one that everyone saw but no one spoke of. He despised weakness, or at least what he considered weakness. And in his narrow view, Elijah, the janitor, embodied it. It began with subtle jabs, comments tossed carelessly in front of others. "Don't miss that corner. Mop boy," Victor would sneer, loud enough for the trainees to laugh. "But you can't even lift more than that bucket." Each time, Elijah kept his head down, saying nothing, continuing his work. Silence was his armor. But Victor mistook silence for submission. He grew bolder. He would throw towels at Elijah and order him to pick them up. He mocked his race, his job, his quiet nature, everything he could to make himself feel bigger. To Victor, humiliating Elijah was sport. And like any sport, he played it in front of a crowd. One Friday evening, after a particularly grueling sparring session, Victor stood in the center of the ring, sweat glistening on his arms, his chest heaving with pride. Around him, fighters leaned on the ropes or sat on benches, watching their trainer bask in his own dominance. Elijah was nearby, mopping the edges of the mat, careful to stay out of the way. Victor's eyes landed on him like a predator spotting prey. "Hey, janitor," he called, voice booming across the gym. "You see these kids? They bleed, they sweat, they fight for their dreams. What do you do? Clean up after them? Must feel nice to live off scraps." The gym erupted in nervous laughter. Elijah paused for only a moment before returning to his work, his face unreadable. But Victor wasn't done. "Tell me something," Victor continued, pacing across the ring. "Have you ever been in a fight?" "Nah, of course not. Men like you don't fight. They hide, always cleaning up someone else's mess instead of facing your own." Elijah's hands tightened on the mop handle. He wanted to speak, but he knew words would only feed the fire. Still, his silence enraged Victor more than any answer could. "You know what?" Victor shouted suddenly. "Get in here. Yeah, you heard me. Drop that mop and step into this ring. Let's see if you've got even an ounce of fight in you." The crowd gasped. Trainees exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. They knew this was cool, a spectacle meant to humiliate. But none dared to stop it. The balance of power in that gym was too fragile. Elijah looked up, meeting Victor's eyes. For the first time, he spoke, his voice calm but steady. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to work." Victor smirked, feeding off the attention. "Scared? That's what I thought. Come on, folks, let's give him a hand. The mop boy is about to prove he's just as weak as he looks." Chants rose from a few of the younger trainees, pressured into going along. "Fight! Fight! Fight!" they called, though unease lingered in their tone. Elijah sighed quietly. He wanted no part of this. He wasn't there to entertain anyone, and he certainly didn't know Victor a thing. But as he turned to continue his cleaning, a towel flew across the room and struck him in the back of the head. Victor laughed, pointing at him. "See that? Can't even stand up for yourself. What kind of man are you?" That question, spoken not in jest but with venom, hit deeper than any insult before. Elijah set the mop aside. His movements were slow and deliberate, not rushed or angry. He removed his work gloves, folded them neatly on the bench, and stepped toward the ring. The gym fell silent. No one expected him to accept. No one thought he would step inside. Victor grinned, baring his teeth like a wolf. "That's it. Show them what you've got, mop boy." Elijah climbed through the ropes, his posture calm, his eyes unblinking. He stood barefoot on the mat, his janitor's uniform clinging to his frame. To most, he looked out of place, a man dragged into a world he didn't belong in. But a few noticed something different, the quiet steadiness in his stance, the way his shoulders relaxed, and the way his breathing slowed. Victor, blinded by ego, didn't notice at all. He barked at one of his assistants to bring gloves, but Elijah shook his head. "I don't need them." Laughter filled the gym. No gloves? Against a trained MMA fighter? Madness. The bell rang. Not official. Just someone tapping the post to signal the start. Victor circled, fists raised, smirking at his easy prey. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply waited. Victor lunged forward with a mocking jab, pulling his punch at the last second to humiliate Elijah rather than hurt him. But before the trainer could retreat, Elijah moved. It was fast, so fast that I barely caught it. A single step, a pivot of the hips, and a fist drove upward with precision and force. It connected cleanly with Victor's jaw. The sound was sharp, like a crack of thunder. Victor's body stiffened, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed flat on the mat. Silence. The entire gym froze. The arrogance, the laughter, the chant, all gone in an instant. The king of the gym, the man who humiliated others for sport, lay unconscious at the feet of the janitor he mocked. Elijah stood over him, his breathing still calm, his expression unchanged. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his fists, and didn't say a word. He simply stepped back, adjusted his shirt, and walked toward the ropes. As he climbed out of the ring, he spoke softly, his words carrying through the stunned silence. Respect is earned, not demanded. Then he picked up his mop, dipped it into the bucket, and returned to his work. The fighters remained frozen, their eyes shifting from Victor's fallen body to Elijah's quiet figure. For the first time, they saw the janitor not as a shadow but as a man of strength, dignity, and unshakable pride. The sound of Victor's body hitting the mat reverberated in the gym long after the strike. It wasn't just a noise, it was a shockwave that followed. Dozens of eyes darted from the unconscious trainer to the janitor calmly resuming his work, as if nothing had happened. No one dared speak. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the squeak of Elijah's mop against the floor. When Victor finally stirred, groaning and clutching his jaw, the silence cracked. A few fighters rushed to help him up, while others kept their distance, unsure if they should side with their fallen leader or the man who had just humbled him in one effortless move. Victor's pride was in pieces, but his voice still carried arrogance, though now tinged with shame. That was a lucky shot," he muttered, his words slurred from the blow. "You caught me off guard. Don't think for a second you." But the sentence faltered. Victor saw the looks in his students' eyes. They weren't convinced by his excuse. Some even looked at him with disappointment. The aura of invincibility he had built over years had been shattered in seconds. And it wasn't another trained fighter who broke it. It was a man he had mocked as a janitor. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any argument Victor could muster. He simply continued to mop the edges of the mat, each stroke deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he had already left the moment behind, as if knocking out the trainer wasn't an act of triumph, but merely a response to injustice. That night, whispers filled the locker rooms. Some spoke with awe. Did you see how fast he moved? That wasn't luck. He knew exactly what he was doing. Others were skeptical, clinging to Victor's narrative. Maybe the old man just slipped. Maybe Victor wasn't ready. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread beyond the gym walls. Trainees told friends, friends told neighbors, and soon the tale of the janitor who floored an MMA trainer in one hit became a local legend. People were fascinated, not just by the knockout, but by the dignity with which Elijah carried himself afterward. But fame, even unwanted fame, carries a price. Victor's pride festered. He couldn't bear the humiliation of being overshadowed by a man he had ridiculed. His bruised jaw healed in days, but his bruised ego deepened with every whisper, every sidelong glance. Students no longer looked at him with unquestioning respect. They asked silent questions with their eyes. Could this man really teach us strength if he himself had been so easily defeated? The tension grew. Some fighters started greeting Elijah with nods of respect when they saw him in the halls, small acknowledgments of the man he truly was. Others still ignored him out of habit, but none mocked him anymore, not after what they'd seen. One evening, as Elijah wiped down the benches after closing, a young trainee named Marco approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said softly, almost embarrassed to address him. Elijah looked up, surprised. No one had ever called him sir in that gym. "Yes. I just wanted to say, that was incredible. The way you stood up for yourself, the way you handled it. I've been here for months, and I've never seen Victor like that. You didn't even brag. You just did it. I respect that." Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes kind but distant. Respect isn't about what happens in the ring. It's about how you carry yourself outside of it. Marco nodded eagerly. "I want to learn that. Not just how to fight, but how to be like that. Do you teach?" Elijah shook his head, returning to his work. "I don't teach. I clean. That's my job here." But Marco persisted. "With all due respect, sir, that's not all you are. I saw the way you moved. That wasn't luck. You fought before, haven't you?" Elijah paused. His gaze drifted for a moment, far beyond the walls of the gym, into memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Finally, he spoke quietly. "A long time ago." Marco wanted to ask more, but the weight in Elijah's tone told him not to push. He bowed his head in gratitude and walked away, leaving the janitor alone with his thoughts. The truth was, Elijah had once been a fighter. Not for fame, not for trophies, but for survival. Growing up in a neighborhood where violence was a currency and respect had to be fought for, he had learnt the art of self-defense early. His fists had protected him, his family, and even strangers in the wrong place at the wrong time. But fighting had also cost him. Opportunities lost, relationships strained, scars that never healed. Eventually, he had chosen a different path. He had walked away from the ring, from the streets, from everything that tied him to a life of conflict. But Victor had dragged him back, not with fists, but with humiliation. Now, whether Elijah wanted it or not, the past was awake again. The following week, the gym's atmosphere shifted. Some students subtly distanced themselves from Victor, while others whispered questions to Elijah whenever they could. Who was he? Where had he trained? Why did he hide his talent? Elijah never gave direct answers. He kept his past locked away, unwilling to step back into that world. Victor, however, was not willing to let the matter rest. His pride demanded revenge. Late one evening, after most of the trainees had left, he confronted Elijah in the storage room. "You think you embarrass me." Victor hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You got lucky. That's all. You don't belong here. You're nothing but a janitor. Don't forget that." Elijah set down the supplies he was organizing and met Victor's glare with calm eyes. "Respect works both ways. I never wanted this. But you pushed me." Victor's fists clenched. He wanted to swing, to prove himself again. But something in Elijah's steady gaze stopped him. For the first time, Victor realized this wasn't a man to be toyed with. This wasn't weakness disguised as humility. This was strength, real strength, the kind he couldn't intimidate or control. Victor left without another word, but his hatred simmered. Meanwhile, the gym's owner, Mr. Ramirez, heard about the incident. Unlike Victor, Ramirez had a deep respect for Elijah. He had hired him not just because he needed a janitor, but because he saw in Elijah a quiet reliability, a man who never complained, never cut corners, and never caused trouble. "Elijah," Ramirez said one morning, catching him before work, "I heard about what happened in the ring." Elijah sighed, bracing himself. "If you want me to leave, I understand." Ramirez shook his head. "Leave? No, my friend. You've earned more respect than anyone here. What you did, it wasn't about fighting. It was about dignity. That's something this place needs more of." Elijah nodded, grateful. But he also felt the weight of Ramirez's words. Dignity was heavy. It demanded responsibility. That evening, as the gym buzzed with activity, Marco and a few other young fighters approached Elijah again. This time, they weren't asking out of curiosity. They were asking out of hope. "Please," Marco said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Teach us, not just how to fight, but how to be men like you, calm, strong, respectful. We need someone like you." Elijah hesitated. He had promised himself he was done with teaching lessons through fists. But as he looked into their eyes, he saw something different. They weren't hungry for violence or ego. They were hungry for guidance. And for the first time in years, Elijah wondered if maybe, just maybe, his past could serve a purpose. Not to glorify fighting, but to teach dignity in a world that often stripped it away. But Victor would not allow it. In the shadows of the gym, the trainer's pride turned into a dangerous obsession. If Elijah became more respected than him, Victor knew he would lose everything: his authority, his students, his reputation. And Victor Kane was not a man who gave up power easily. The storm was coming, and Elijah, despite his desire for peace, would soon find himself at its center once again. Rumors have a way of growing larger than the truth. What began as whispers in the gym spread quickly beyond its walls. Within weeks, the tale of the janitor who knocked out an MMA trainer was being retold in barbershops, cafes, and community centers. Some said Elijah's punch was so fast Victor didn't even see it. Others exaggerated that Victor was unconscious for 10 minutes straight. Each retelling added color to the story, but at its core was a simple truth. Elijah had stood his ground with dignity and silenced the bully in front of everyone. But for Elijah, the attention was a curse. He never wanted to be known as a man who embarrassed Victor Kane. He wanted no spotlight, no glory. Every morning, he still arrived at the gym before dawn, pushing his mop across the mats, cleaning showers, refilling soap dispensers, and taking out trash. To him, nothing had changed. But to everyone else, everything had. The younger fighters began watching him more closely. They studied the way he carried himself, his calm, deliberate movements, and the patience in his eyes. When they sparred, they tried to mimic his composure, even though none of them had ever seen him fight beyond that single moment. For them, Elijah represented a different kind of strength: quiet, controlled, unshaken. Victor, however, was unraveling. The once confident trainer grew irritable, snapping at students during drills, pushing them harder than necessary, and lashing out whenever he heard Elijah's name mentioned. His pride had been wounded, but worse than the punch itself was a respect that shifted away from him and toward the man he despised. Late one night, Victor sat alone in his office, a bottle of whiskey half empty on his desk. His jaw had healed, but his ego had not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah's fist coming toward him and saw the pity in the eyes of his students as they watched him fall. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself. "He humiliated me. He's not going to take what I built." Fueled by bitterness, Victor began scheming. He started telling anyone who would listen that Elijah had blindsided him, that the punch was nothing more than a fluke. To some of the younger, impressionable fighters, his words carried weight, but most had seen it with their own eyes. They knew the truth. Elijah hadn't been lucky. He had been precise. Victor's obsession grew darker. He began staying late after the gym closed, shadowboxing in the ring, replaying the fight in his head. He convinced himself that if he could force Elijah back into the ring, he could reclaim his honor. He didn't want to just beat Elijah. He wanted to destroy him. Meanwhile, Elijah continued his quiet routine. But though he tried to ignore the attention, it followed him everywhere. At the grocery store, strangers approached him. "You're the guy who knocked out Victor, right?" At church, elders patted his back with pride. Even children on the block mimicked throwing a punch and laugh, shouting his name. Elijah accepted it with humility, offering a polite smile but never feeding the story. To him, it wasn't about the knockout. It was about standing up when dignity was stripped away. That was a message he carried, though few understood it as deeply as he did. One evening, after most of the fighters had left, Elijah was scrubbing down the locker room benches when Marco returned. He was joined this time by two other young men, Jamal and Eric. "Sir," Marco began, his voice cautious, "we've been talking. We know you don't want to be a trainer, but We could really use your guidance. Not just with fighting, but with life. You've been through things we don't understand, and we want to learn." Elijah looked at them. Their faces carried sincerity, the hunger of young men searching for direction in a world that often led them astray. He sighed, setting down the rag he held. "I won't teach you how to fight for pride," he said firmly. "I won't teach you to hurt others just to feel powerful. But if you're willing to learn discipline, respect, and control, then maybe I can share a little." The three young men lit up with gratitude. From that night on, Elijah began meeting them after hours, when the gym was nearly empty. He didn't throw them into sparring or drills. Instead, he taught them the fundamentals of balance, breathing, and patience. He explained that fighting was not about aggression, but about stillness, about waiting for the right moment. He told them that fists were tools, but dignity was a weapon far greater. His lessons went beyond combat. He spoke about life, about carrying oneself with humility even when disrespected, and about rising above insult without lowering oneself. For Marco, Jamal, and Eric, these words hit harder than any punch. But as Elijah quietly built this bond with the youth, Victor watched with simmering rage. He saw his students gravitating toward the janitor, seeking wisdom from him instead of their official trainer. Each time Elijah's calm voice echoed across the gym, Victor's authority felt weaker. One Friday night, Victor finally snapped. As Elijah was preparing to leave, Victor stepped in front of him near the door. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath heavy with drink. "You think you're some kind of hero." Victor spat. "You think knocking me out once makes you a better man? You're nothing, Elijah. Nothing but a janitor who got lucky." Elijah stood still, his face composed. "I never asked for any of this. You brought it on yourself." Victor sneered. "Then prove it wasn't luck. Get back in the ring with me. Right here, right now. We'll settle this once and for all." Elijah shook his head. "I don't need to fight you again." The refusal only enraged Victor further. He shoved Elijah in the chest. "What's the matter? Afraid they'll see the truth this time? Afraid they'll realize you're nothing but a fraud?" The sound of the scuffle drew attention. A handful of students still lingering in the gym turned and gathered around. Marco, Jamal, and Eric rushed forward, standing beside Elijah. "He doesn't need to prove anything," Marco said firmly. "We all saw what happened. You lost, Victor. That's the truth." Victor's face twisted in fury. "Shut up, kid. You don't know what you're talking about." But Elijah raised a hand, silencing the growing tension. "I told you before, respect is earned, not demanded. I don't fight for pride, and I won't fight just to satisfy your ego." For a moment, it seemed Victor would strike him right there. His fist trembled, his jaw clenched. But something stopped him, not fear, but the realization that another impulsive act of violence would only make him look smaller in front of his students. So instead, Victor leaned close, his voice a whisper sharp enough to cut. "This isn't over. I'll find a way to show everyone who you really are." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The students turned to Elijah, concern etched on their faces. "He's going to come after you," Eric warned. Elijah nodded slowly. "I know, but sometimes the hardest battles aren't in the ring. They're here," he said, tapping his chest. In the weeks that followed, Victor's obsession turned dangerous. He began training harder than ever, pushing his body past its limits. He spoke to promoters, arranging underground matches, hinting that soon the city would see who the real fighter was. Behind the scenes, he spread rumors about Elijah, claims that Elijah had cheated, that he had a violent past, and that he wasn't the dignified man people believed him to be. But the truth is a way of shining through lies. For every rumor Victor whispered, Elijah's quiet actions spoke louder. His respect for others, his guidance to the youth, his calm presence, all of it built a reputation no smear campaign could destroy. Still, the storm was inevitable. Victor wasn't finished. He wanted more than revenge. He wanted Elijah broken, humiliated beyond repair. And to get what he wanted, he was willing to go further than anyone expected. The stage was being set for a confrontation far larger than a single punch in a gym. It was no longer about a fight. It was about dignity pride, and the power of a man who refused to be defined by someone else's hatred. And deep down, Elijah knew, whether he wanted it or not, the fight would come to him again. The city buzzed with the whispers of a challenge. Victor Kane had made sure of it. Word spread that he was preparing for an unofficial match, a fight that would expose the truth about Elijah, the janitor who had humiliated him. He boasted that Elijah's knockout punch would be nothing more than luck and that, given a real fight, he would crush him. Elijah ignored the noise. Every morning, he still carried his mop through the gym, still nodded politely at strangers who looked at him with awe, and still offered quiet lessons to Marco, Jamal, and Eric after hours. But deep down, he knew this was not going away. Victor's pride would not allow it. One evening, Mr. Ramirez approached Elijah while he was sweeping the lobby. "I've been hearing things," the gym owner said, his brow furrowed. "Victor is pushing for a fight with you. He's talking to people outside the gym, even promoters. If this keeps up, he'll drag you into something ugly." Elijah set his broom aside. His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed a tiredness. "I don't want to fight him, Ramirez. I walked away from that life years ago." Ramirez nodded. "I know, but sometimes walking away isn't enough. Sometimes people like Victor won't stop until they destroy themselves or someone else." That night, Elijah lay awake in his modest apartment, staring at the ceiling. Memories flooded back. Fights in dimly lit gyms, fists flying for survival, the roar of crowds that cheered not for dignity, but for violence. He had left it all behind to find peace. Yet peace had a way of being challenged. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Victor, desperate for attention, stormed into the gym during peak hours, cameras in tow. A local amateur fight promoter followed him, grinning at the spectacle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor shouted, standing in the middle of the ring, "you've all heard the rumors. You've all heard the lies. Tonight, I put them to rest. Tonight, I challenge the janitor, Elijah, to step into this ring and prove once and for all whether he is a fighter or fraud." Gasps filled the room. Dozens of trainees, regular gym-goers, and curious onlookers turned toward Elijah, who stood quietly in the corner with his mop. Marco, Jamal, and Eric rushed to his side, their faces full of protest. "Don't do it, sir," Marco pleaded. "You don't need to prove anything." Elijah looked at the three of them, then at the crowd, then finally at Victor, whose arrogance oozed from every pore. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Elijah set the mop against the wall and walked toward the ring. "I don't fight for pride," Elijah said softly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But if you won't stop until you learn respect, then I'll teach you." The gym erupted. Phones came out. Everyone wanted to capture the showdown, the arrogant trainer against the quiet janitor. Victor smirked, strapping on his gloves. "This time, no lucky shot. This time, I end you." Elijah entered the ring barefoot, wearing only his work pants and shirt. He didn't bother with gloves, just as before. His stance was calm, his breathing steady. He wasn't here to destroy Victor. He was here to end the cycle of humiliation. The bell rang. Victor came out swinging, fists flying with desperate speed. He lunged, jabbed, and kicked, throwing every technique he had drilled into his body over years of training. But Elijah moved like water. Each strike missed by inches, each attack met with effortless sidesteps. He wasn't fighting Victor. He was teaching him a lesson. The crowd watched in awe as the janitor danced around the trainer, his movements calm, precise, and almost graceful. Victor's rage grew with every miss. Sweat poured down his face. His strikes became wild and sloppy. He screamed with frustration. "Stand still and fight me," he roared. Elijah finally struck, not with fists, but with words. "This isn't fighting, Victor. This is desperation." The words cut deeper than any punch. But Victor charged again, reckless and blind. That's when Elijah acted. With one swift, clean motion, he stepped inside Victor's guard and delivered a single, controlled strike to his chest, not enough to break, not enough to injure, but enough to send him sprawling backward onto the mat. Victor lay there, gasping for breath, staring up at the lights. Silence consumed the room. Elijah stood over him, not triumphant, not boastful, just steady, calm. Fighting doesn't make you strong, Elijah said, his voice ringing clear. Humility does. Respect does. You wanted to break me to prove yourself. But true strength is not about breaking others. It's about lifting them up. The crowd was still. Some lowered their phones, realizing they were not just watching a fight, but witnessing a truth. Victor's chest heaved as he struggled to sit up. His pride was shattered, his body broken not by force but by dignity. For the first time in years, he had no words. Elijah offered him a hand. The gesture shocked everyone. Victor stared at it, shame burning in his eyes. Slowly, trembling, he accepted. Elijah pulled him to his feet, steadying him as the crowd watched. The moment was more powerful than the knockout weeks before. In that single act of mercy, Elijah reclaimed not just his own dignity, but also offered Victor a chance to reclaim his. From that day forward, the gym changed. Elijah's role was no longer just a janitor. He became a mentor, not officially, not with titles, but with presence. Young men and women came to him not to learn how to fight, but to learn how to live with dignity, humility, and strength of character. Victor, humbled, stepped back from his pedestal. He still trained fighters, but with a quieter tone, less arrogance, and more patience. He never spoke of the humiliation again, but he carried the lesson like a scar, visible only to himself. As for Elijah, he never sought glory, never told his story with pride, but people told it for him. And each retelling wasn't about the knockout or the spectacle. It was about a man who showed that true strength lies not in fists, but in the refusal to let pride or prejudice define him. Years later, Marco, Jamal, and Eric would look back and remember the nights they trained under Elijah, not just learning balance of the body, but balance of the soul. They would carry his lessons into their lives, teaching others that dignity cannot be stripped away unless you allow it. And in that quiet gym, where sweat and blood once painted the mats, a different kind of legacy was born. Not of titles, not of victories, but of respect. For Elijah, that was the only victory that mattered.